So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today in our monthly InfoSec seminar organized by the Information System Security and Assurance Management Department in Mahalshan School of Management. We begin our November InfoSec seminar by acknowledging that although this seminar is being held virtually, Concordia University of Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground and home for many indigenous peoples, including Cree, Salto, Blackfoot, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux peoples. We respect and acknowledge this. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Alison Yakshan, our Q Deans of Management, who invited our great speaker today. Today, we are pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Jarret Leaman, to give us an interesting talk about the challenges faced by Canada's Indigenous people in cybersecurity. Jarret is a member of Magneton First Nation located in Southern Ontario, who is passionate about Indigenous economic development, technology, reconciliation, and building leadership capacity within the Indigenous community. Jarret has been recognized as a national Indigenous leader as one of the Huffington Post's top 3 Indigenous millennials in Canada, top 10 to watch by the Indigenous Economics Institute in 2020, and was selected to participate on the Governor General Leadership Conference in 2017 and the Civic Action Diverse City Fellowship Program in 2015. Thanks, Jarret, for being with us today. And one more thing, please be sure to provide us with your name and the email address in the linked form so we may send your certificate of attendance. So it's all yours now, Jarret.
Hello, bonjour, Ani. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Joining you today from the Toronto region. I'm here at my home institution, which is Centennial College, and I am a professor in the business school here. Today I'm going to be talking to you some of the work and research that's been done by the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology, which is a national nonprofit that I founded about 6 or 7 years ago, and it has been going strong ever since. So I'm just going to be talking a bit about security today, but more so about how security plays into sort of the framework that I look at Indigenous, bridging the digital divide within the Indigenous community, because it's a part of something that we are going to be thinking of as we in our communities move forward. So bonjour Anin, Jarret Disnakash Magnetawan First Nation Donjba Kimendit Dotum. And so I'm a member of Magnetawan First Nation, which is located in the Schnell Bay community outside of Parry Sound, Ontario, which is pretty south in Ontario. And yeah, so we'll get started. If somebody can let me know if there's questions, you can always ask. I just can't really see there, so just feel free, Aslan, just to interrupt if there's a question that people would have I would like to answer. So when I look at bridging the digital divide, I sort of look at it from sort of 4 different pillars in technology. And I think maybe, so you can see the little images that I have here, but I think before we get into that, we can really talk about sort of Indigenous people in technology in Canada to begin with. We have a lot of communities, First Nation communities, for example, that are rural and in the north that don't have access to internet or fast internet. And that would really limit a lot of what they could do online, and also in parts of our north as well. And so when we look at digital technology in First Nation governments, for example, or First Nation communities, it can be limited, but it is important to note that around 50% of the First Nation population in Canada does live off reserve, and so they may live in urban settings that would have access to internet as well. I think also too, when we're talking about Indigenous people today and we're talking about sort of what does that look like, it's important to note that there is a diversity amongst the Indigenous community in Canada, within Canada's borders. So there would be First Nation individuals like myself, and we would be typically are divided into groups, sometimes based off of our registry. So that would be First Nation, would be status or non-status. And there is also Métis individuals, as we heard earlier, who would have been come from traditionally from the Métis Red River settlement, who have a distinct culture and language called Michif, for example, is the language. And then we also have the Inuit people, which are typically in the regions in the north. There's 4 different regions of Inuit peoples across Canada, not just in Nunavut, which is a territory, as well as the Northwest Territories, but there's also Inuit people that would be in northern Quebec as well as Labrador. So that's a little bit about sort of the diversity of the Indigenous community within Canada, and between those 3 groups, with those subgroups, it's important to note that there's 4 sort of main differences between that I kind of categorize it by at a high level. So there would be differences between the Indigenous communities would be geographical, as I had mentioned. So typically, for example, Inuit people are predominantly only in the north, as is their traditional territories. So there may be First Nation individuals that live in the north, but they're not historically from there. So there's geographical differences. There's also cultural differences. So a First Nation person from British Columbia region, for example, maybe a Chilcotin or one of the Coast Salish tribes would be very, very different than myself as a First Nation individual, as an Anishinaabe person. We have very different languages. And very different cultures, and we have, and that is the similarity between First Nation, Métis, and Inuit as well. There's also legal differences. So First Nation individuals typically would be assigned with a treaty. So my treaty with Canada is the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. That community is, that treaty was around before Canada was a country. And so when we had Confederation in 1867, if I got my history right, what that means as Canada is constituted is that that's part of the constitution of the country. This will be important later when we're talking about security. And so that would be a pre-Confederation treaty. It's also important to note that in Canada, in our political system, we are not a republic like the United States. So United States and the republic means they sort of forego all of their previous laws and contracts prior to becoming a republic. In Canada, we're a confederation, so those make up the fabric of our country. So that's some legal differences. There is also legal differences between the Métis and Inuit. So a Métis individual may have constitutional rights to hunting and other areas, but not so much land, except for if you're in Alberta, which there is settlement land, Métis communities in the province, I believe, where you are learning from today. And so that's different than in other parts of the country. So there's and there's geographical, legal, cultural, and then there's political differences. So political differences, it can be described as, a First Nation individual from an Anishinaabe community like myself typically doesn't have hereditary chief systems like you would see in British Columbia, for example, where you have, in the Coast Salish, they would have a hereditary chief system where those are families born into that role, whereas other First Nation tribes, for example, in central Canada or on the plains, that have a very different political system. All of the different groups, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, also have a Western governance system in play. So First Nation individuals would have a tribal government, I guess you could say, or would be a First Nation Indian government that is outlined in the Indian Act. Then when the Métis system is also sort of done into locals and has a very distinct way of managing their in each region. So Métis, for example, would not really be east of Ontario as per the Powley Supreme Court case. So you would have sort of locals and regional councils that lead up into a provincial treaty organization like the Métis Nation of Ontario or the Métis Nation of BC, the Métis Nation of Alberta. And the Inuit typically have a political system that nowadays that is typically more of which is a territorial government, as we know that Nunavut was made into a territory in 1992, I believe. I still remember the days when the map was not Nunavut as a territory; it was a much larger area, and so. They also have autonomous regions in Canada for political and from a political perspective. So if you look at one of the 4 areas of the Inuit population in Canada, most particularly in northern Labrador and Newfoundland, there is an autonomous region in the Inuktitut. I have a hard time pronouncing it, but there's a sort of an autonomous region that exists within Canada. There is also an autonomous region that exists in Alberta as well, with a First Nation government south of Calgary, I believe. I'm from Ontario, so I know my Ontario focused training and learning. But yeah, so those are some of the differences that I sort of like to outline around Indigenous people, and that's going to be important when we talk about security and when we talk about bridging the digital divide. Any questions on that? I know that was a lot of information. Is there anything that anyone wanted to add? Okay, not seeing anything. So,
any questions for this very nice introduction and history?
Yeah, so I have a question. This is Harvinder. I'm alumni to this program. So like, kind of, how do you guys are like, kind of like, staying up to date with like, this much gap and like, kind of with like, having this wide background, like, where like we know, like, I only worked one individual, Jerry Paulus, like, who was like an indigenous, like, person in technology, and I'm working in Canada for almost 8 years now, but didn't met many. So like, how you are keeping like with so much less resources and you have to do so much work, like, kind of.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so we can talk a little bit about the Center for Indigenous Innovation, and I'll go into that now about why I'm doing this. So my background is in business administration. I have an undergrad in business administration with a specialization in human resources and Indigenous economic development. And I also have a master's degree in industrial relations, where I have an emphasis in comparative law that I studied in the UK, focusing on comparing human rights and labor systems between the European Union and Canada. And so I wasn't actually in the tech sector, and I'm not a sort of tech person per se. When I started out my journey, I worked in the university sector prior to 2017, mostly at the legislative and regulatory level. So working on developing in Ontario, helped be a part of a team that was working on developing Indigenous Institutes Act, which is a legislative and regulatory regime that outlined independent Indigenous sort of universities and colleges and trades and training institutes here in Ontario. And so I don't come from sort of the tech background, but what I did notice when I was part of the Governor General's tour in 2017, I was up in the Northwest Territories, and I was expecting there to be less technology, but there was actually in the far north where I was pretty good technology, and there was really good cell service, which I thought was going to be not the case, and it wasn't like that everywhere, but it was more than I thought it was going to be. And so in 2017, I decided that, I think there's some work to be done on the Indigenous digital divide. How are Indigenous people in my community using technology? Are they using technology? And predominantly, they weren't at that time. yeah, a lot of the time there's, even up until about 2 or 3 years ago, First Nation governments and communities didn't really have websites either. And they are constitutionally sovereign nations within the jurisdiction of Canada. And so what that means is that when you go into a First Nation community or on a reservation, there is laws that apply there and laws that don't apply there. And an example from my studying in Ontario and from labor law, for example, is the area of health and safety law. So health and safety law in Ontario is a provincial jurisdiction, and it's self-reporting. So if you are a company that has your own business and you're logging and you're not providing a safe environment for your workers and their fingers are getting cut off, then the workers would go to the hospital and then that would get reported, and the employer is expected to do that, to report that accident. But what happens when there is a provincial agency that is overseeing and enforcing that regulation, and what is the applicability of that regulation on a federal territory? And so there, at the end of the day, if the Ministry of Labor doesn't have an agreement with the nation, they probably are not going to be going on the reserve to check out whether, there's a safeties up, this trucking or this logging company is up to date on its safety, for example. So there's always sort of exceptions in regulations in this. And so it's a complex area, and technology and data is linked a lot in this space, and cybersecurity protects that system and that data. And so with not a lot of individuals being in that space, but having the governance and legal understanding of the major implications of how those roll out, I decided to found the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology in 2017, 2018. And then I went and did also some work in the private sector on building actual sort of software options, blockchain technology for communities, and did that up until 2020, roughly around 2023. When in that time, and the goal of founding the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology was to increase Indigenous representation in the technology space. I didn't see a lot of individuals in the space, and I myself, founding and leading up the work on a national nonprofit focused on technology and innovation, and not being in that field and not a technologist, was the issue that I was looking to solve. And so what we do at the center is we have 3 areas of work that we focus on: advocacy, collaborative innovative networks, so bringing and putting on events to bring together Indigenous people that are in the technology and innovation spaces, as well as research. And so some of the research that I have done was presented in a journal, the Municipal World Journal, as a future fellow. I was a future city fellow in 2019 and 2020, I believe. And I wrote an academic article looking at the implications of blockchain enablement in First Nation communities, and how that actually really helps with the protection of Indigenous data, which has historically been very vulnerable and used against our people. So our collection of our Indian Act registry information that we had, if you're a First Nation status individual, is the information that was used to roll out the residential school system that we had in play in Canada until 1995. So Indigenous protection of Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty is very, very important. And so by doing this work and by bringing on sponsors, as well as expanding the team, we are able to sort of work as a nonprofit to start to get information and put Indigenous issues and technology at least on the map or on the radar. And we've been able to do that through the nonprofit, through partnerships. And so we, for example, partner with the Coalition of Innovation Leaders Against Racism, which is based out of the Marsh Discovery District here in Toronto. That has about 30 of the biggest tech employers, and we provide work and services to that network around indigenizing technology. And we've also done events focused on tech innovators especially in digital creators as well. And so we did a panel where we heard from Indigenous innovation leaders across Canada and shared that as well with TD Bank. So that's sort of the work that sort of the center has been doing over the last 5 and 6 years. I'm a volunteer and the board chair, and there is an executive director, and his name is Rod Thomas, and he is a member of Six Nations, which is located here in Ontario. Did I answer it?
Awesome. Yeah, this is like, kind of good to see that kind of effort is like going, so thank you.
Great. So, Jarret, as we have like 1 hour for the seminar up to 1, so could you please go in to your presentation?
Yeah, certainly. So when we're looking about thinking about cybersecurity and Indigenous, the importance of that, I did mention and talk about why data sovereignty is very critical. And I talked about the legislative framework and the overview around sort of Indigenous diversity within Canada for a reason, because when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about data sovereignty, Indigenous people's sovereignty over their own data. The jurisdiction matters and the legal framework matters, and it matters for a couple of reasons. First reason being that there is frameworks in play around privacy and access to data and access to and security measures that be in place. For example, in the provinces, that would be in relation to medical records. And so when we're thinking about cybersecurity and we're thinking about software that's being developed and the changing landscape around cybersecurity, with the introduction of blockchain ecosystems within sort of these spaces, there is a perfect example of Estonia in Eastern Europe that has a completely blockchain-enabled digital government, and I think they've had that for about 15 years, with about 99% of their government services offered online through a blockchain system. And so the ecosystem and security that a blockchain software technology can deliver and offer to government and digital matters is really critical. And I believe it's immutable at this point, still, but that could change. But how do you then, I think when we talk about Indigenous communities, bridging the digital divide, starting to use technology in order to have a need for cybersecurity. What we have is we have a lot of communities that don't have any access to even connectivity at all. And so when you look at this chart here, I kind of have divided up this idea of Indigenous bridging the digital divide into 4 pillars. And so the first one would be connectivity. So that's why I keep bringing it up on that. So, a community is not going to need cybersecurity measures if they don't have any connectivity and nothing online. And so then there's other areas that go into the development of connectivity, and that's not something that I have particularly worked a lot on, but it's a very large issue in Canada today, and there's a lot of money being spent on that. Then when we go into pillar 2, we talk about data governance and management and data sovereignty, and I've been sort of alluding to this previously in this conversation. So when we look about data governance and data management and a legal understanding of how data sovereignty from an Indigenous perspective translates into legal aspects is really important to understand, because when you're enabling or putting in a blockchain ecosystem in government that at this point may be immutable, that it's important to then understand that a blockchain ecosystem requires is a ledger system that requires an understanding of the laws that are applicable in that region. So if the laws are not applicable or different, so for example, in a First Nation jurisdiction than they would be in the rest of Canada, then the blockchain ecosystem would need to be, coding would need to be developed to understand that. And so that is why the data governance framework is really important and how it relates to cybersecurity or the security of, for example, Indigenous data in relation to sovereignty. And so if you are looking to implement some cybersecurity measures through a blockchain ecosystem at this point on a reserve, then you would need to understand if the nation has passed any different laws or has a book of laws that can be fed into the development of the blockchain ecosystem or the blockchain software in order to make it immutable and make it between the 13 or 14 different servers that have the high security. So understanding the governance is really, really important. And in Canada, we have a whole treaty obligation that we have signed in regards to UNDRIP around respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. And the federal government has had a timeline of about 5 years of implementation for that. And we've seen in the last 5 years in the federal budget, not a lot of money, I think probably between like 30 and 50 million a year going into understanding how Indigenous data sovereignty is applicable and what does that look like and how can they encourage the growth of that. And that's going to be important in several areas. Obviously, the first one being data governance of a blockchain ecosystem, but also in regards to IP and ownership of, for example, say a data system or a tech product that an Indigenous tech entrepreneur may want to create, and who owns that IP, where does it sit? Is a really, really important piece that they are still working through. And so CIIT and myself in February of this year, I was called before the Science and Research Committee at the House of Commons to talk about how IP law can be, what are the implications of intellectual property law and how the regime is set up in Canada? How does Indigenous data sovereignty fit into that model? And it's a really good question. And there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of work that still needs to be done in that area. And an example that I can give on that would be if you have a video game that you create, and it includes Indigenous people and Indigenous culture and knowledge. So think of like Assassin's Creed 3, for example, and it recreates Indigenous villages and culture. Who owns that code? And how can a private company own the visual and digital representation of a cultural practice when we've signed international treaties that outline that that's not possible? So there's lots of these really cool questions that will come into that come into play as we continue to work through the implications of IP. Then the third pillar that we have is around technology, infrastructure, and development. So what does that look like? So we went through connectivity. Sorry, I didn't move the slides. So we see data governance here, the areas of data governance that are applicable that you have to think about when you're developing it from an Indigenous lens. And so, data governance, I'll just back up a little bit, is the exercise of authority and control over the data assets that may be in play, and understand. And what's really important in this is understanding the political governance, like I had mentioned. So if you're a First Nation, you're not within Canada, so that means that federal laws apply, but we have areas and jurisdictions that only provincial law is built, like labor, for example, and education, except for if you're First Nation, then there's a federal education framework, but it's only for First Nation status people. When we look at data governance, that's important. And then there's data management as well. So when we're looking at in Pillar 2 data management, that's the actual outcome of what you're doing. And so this may be of interest to some of the people in the class that have been studying. So when you're thinking of it, you asked a question at the beginning. You said, what's it like to be sort of the lonely wolf in the in the front there in this space? But I think I can never, we cannot do it alone. And there's so many different expertise required when you're starting to break down these pillars that I've identified. So data management, for example, that's database systems, that's master data and metadata management. These are all different areas that different individuals can study, some of them even into a master's degree, and just to sort of implement. And And it's an important piece because when you're doing this from a First Nation perspective, for myself, for example, my nation, that nation is a government that has my information. It would be like Canada having your information and it not being secure, right? That would not be acceptable. And we've seen the implications of hacks and whatnot in our banking system. We've seen it in the healthcare system. And we know that, heads roll when when those things happen. And I think from an Ontario perspective, we are still resonating with the, like e-health scandal that really rocked, us in the 2000s and really delayed a lot of our in Ontario, our implementation of electronic health measures in the province. In Canada's most, we have 20% of the whole country's population that live pretty much in the GTA. And so that's a lot of people's health data that was sort of mismanaged. So there's all these different areas that need to be considered when, a nation who just gets connected even in 2021 or 2022, then have to start thinking about these measures. And they really have to start from, here's the laws that we're building once we have internet, and that's the governance, and then the policies that and regulations that government will have will be manifested from a technology perspective in this slide in regards to the architecture, the governance, the transformation and change, the warehousing of that data, and integrated definitions. And it is very important that that information is based in the jurisdiction of that First Nation. So when I was on the Governor General's tour, I was stationed in Northwest Territories, and I was in a lot of flying communities all the way up to Tuktoyaktuk into the Arctic Ocean. I spent a lot of time in Nunavik, for example, which is sort of the biggest town in that area of the far north. And what I noticed was sort of in the middle of nowhere, these roads outside, and there were these like satellites and these like fences around them, and we kind of went and drove over it, but like you couldn't actually drive on that land, or because that land was owned by Sweden, who had a satellite on it for the tracking purposes, and through diplomatic relations that portion of that land would have been Sweden's, and there was people with guns there because they're guarding sort of their intellectual property and or the data that's coming out of that facility. And so I would have an arrangement around, that Canada couldn't just change the laws and usurp that portion of that land in order to access that data. And that's the same sort of typical thing that would be needed, in my perspective, from a First Nation government perspective, as a sovereign nation within Canada, as per the Constitution of Canada and their treaty agreements and arrangements that we have in play today. Sort of outline sort of what a data management strategy would look like. So remember that data management is very different. It's like more of the tactical. I'm more of a data governance person, more of the theoretical sort of notionally what's protections, what laws, like UNDRIP, for example, do we have to consider? What principles do we have to consider? The OCAP principles, for example, that are a governance mechanism that's in play around Indigenous data, which is applicable in security. So it's the governance that outlines why the security is important, who can access it, who can possess it, and who can control it. And after we have digital, in pillar 2, we have data governance, data management, and then we usually talk about digital citizenship. Now this is sort of a newer one that I added in, because I was at a panel at the Toronto Public Library, I think last month, and I was talking about digital citizenship, and I wasn't really familiar with it as much. But again, when you look at a digital citizenship perspective, the event that we were at was really talking about digital etiquette, so bullying, online bullying, and that sort of piece. And what is our role as a digital citizen, of my nation, for example. If my nation has a blockchain ecosystem with servers on its reserve that's only accessible by members, then I would be a digital citizen of a sovereign nation within Canada, and I would have abilities to use the services digitally from my nation. What are my rights and responsibilities of that? What is the digital etiquette that could go along with that? What are the laws that are applicable to that digital ecosystem that I'm accessing and using services through. So these are some of the areas of digital citizenship that are considered, and broadly they're used. I was introduced to it through sort of that online bullying social media perspective, but it's much broader than that when you're thinking about that. And it's when you think about cybersecurity, typically I would think about obviously, hacking and access to data and ransoming of technology and software and that. But also cybersecurity is also, do you feel safe in that space where you're a digital citizen, for example, in this space? So that's another element to sort of think about when you think about around that. And when we look at Indigenous relations and Indigenous people and First Nation people specifically, we in law, typically according to treaties, we don't have access to all of the land in our reserves underneath it. We would have access to portions of the top certain level, and then there's mineral rights and other levels rights down to the core that can be owned or bought or surveyed by other people, for example. And so typically how I see it is when we have we have a chunk of land that's this big, when you have oil underneath it, it comes up, then you have to engage the community to go up and out and over that land. It's almost like a fee, right? Because you have to disturb the layer that's owned by our people first to get access to those. And so when you think about it that way, then we tend to think about it from a mining perspective. But in the digital space, what happens in the sound waves in the clouds above us? So when we're having a digital citizenship, if we have a digital regime that covers our territory around our data, what pieces, how is that measured, and how is that protected going forward in Canada? And from an Indigenous perspective, is sort of taking the oil and gas and mining perspective, but flipping it in the air. That's where cybersecurity comes in really important. And that's where, what are those cybersecurity walls that are around the jurisdiction of the reservation land, for example, in Canada, and what laws apply there and what laws don't. And this has been used a lot and can be clearly demonstrated in the online gambling sector. So we know that gambling, for example, in the United States is illegal, but if you have what we've seen is the online gambling come out of Akwesasne, which is a community, a Mohawk community, sort of around. Talking about jurisdictions, the First Nation community is in Canada, United States, Ontario, and Quebec. So whose laws apply there, and how does that work? So and if you think about it from a digital perspective. Cybersecurity, you say, okay, I'm going to build a specialized blockchain ecosystem to keep, their information data safe. Which laws are you going to use to do for the, for the ledger, for the AI, right? So that is an example of where online gambling has been done in the United States through those servers because of their sovereignty jurisdiction within the region that their servers are based within. So we've talked a lot about recognition and sovereignty. I talk about it. I added it in data management. It's linked a lot with ethics. When we're talking about the ethics of data management, the ethics, of cybersecurity, for example. I think when we think about ethics and the work that you may be doing, in your future, and the work you're doing in cybersecurity potentially, is thinking about it from, what are the impact on people? What is the misuse, and what is the economic value? And understanding the economic value is important, because the next piece of it is, where is that economic value being driven to, and is that ethical? And then in pillar 3, I typically would talk about digital government. There's a whole plethora of information on how digital government is established. So when we think about the 3 pillars, connectivity, we talked about governance, then you need to set up sort of a digital government. For a First Nation perspective, for example, would need to have all of those pieces set out. Cybersecurity and privacy and resiliency, as you can see here in this graph, is a part of all of the ecosystem that needs to be considered. So specific control protocol scenarios should be prepared, and you need to go through it in a systematic way. And there's a lot of research on this, and a lot of governments have already done this, and have digital transformation offices. When we're talking about a First Nation community that maybe just got the internet 5 years ago, they took, our government of Ontario 20 years to do digital transformation. For a First Nation government, it's going to take time and expertise as well. As part of the digital government, the number one thing is also the digital infrastructure. So what does that look like? What are the centers? What are the enterprise portals, the cloud services? And again, cybersecurity is really embedded in each of those areas. And with a First Nation government, for example, who's sort of bridging the digital divide and taking on the role of becoming a digital government, they, for example, would have the ability to leapfrog other communities, learn from Ontario's mistakes, and do that. And cybersecurity should be a lens that's looked at through each of these areas to make sure that it is the most present and most up-to-date and safe system, because we don't want to be part of a system or implementing a product with a nation government that's already 5 years outdated or old, because that's traditionally how things have been done when a federal government was involved prior. And then the last piece of it is digital tools. And so one of the things that we see is you build an ecosystem and say, okay, I have a software solution for a cybersecurity for a First Nation governments, and you go to them and you say, okay, I have the tool. Well, if they're only in the first phase, why would you sell them a tool that won't fit into the whole piece? So when you look at it, and that's why I put tool technology development at the end, because understanding that, you don't want to sell them a cybersecurity option that's not blockchain enabled if they have a blockchain system and it's just not applicable, and or the policy or the rights that are being used are not reflected within the system that's required within the jurisdiction. So just why I always put tools and technology tool development at the end. And it's sort of why I have a thing when you see people, selling technologies to First Nation governments. It just always is interesting to me if the considerations that we've talked about today have been considered. Gretch.
Yeah. So hello guys. So any questions? Any questions? So thank you so much, Jarret, for this very interesting presentation. So any questions from the audience? You presented lots of information. Okay, so any comments, any questions before we end our event?
I think we got the main question in the middle of the talk there.
Yeah.
But it was a great talk, Jarret. Thank you. Oh, hold it. Ingrid? Okay,
great. So I will just remind you about something before we leave the presentation.
One second, Ingrid had her hand up to ask a question.
Okay, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jarret. That was great. I had a question around. I'm in Alberta, and I had a question around. I know there are some First Nations that are operating, let's say, casinos in cities, and not on reserve land. So I was interested in your comments around, which laws then would be in play.
I think that if you looked at it, those casinos are probably on urban reserves.
Actually, the one I'm thinking of is actually not. It's in Red Deer. which is a city, and it's not. It's being owned and operated by a nation. So I'm just curious as, if you have any information about that.
Yeah, and so then there's a framework on gambling. I'm only familiar with Saskatchewan's and Ontario's, and so typically what happens is there's in order for a nation, there had to be a framework developed, and so that framework would cover how that would be and what laws would be applicable. So if you are implementing a system, then you would have a framework to look at as to what jurisdictions apply in that region of that business. And so gaming has its own specific work, and that those would have been negotiated mostly by lawyers and the political treaty organizations, and usually in a provincial settlement way. And so in Alberta, they must have negotiated to have off-reserve casinos being owned by people, because I don't know, we can't do that in Ontario, I believe. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. This is the only one I know of. The other ones are all on reserve in urban areas. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I was just curious.
That was a good one.
So thank you again so much, Jarret, for this interesting presentation. And thank you all for joining us. So please be sure to provide us with your name and the email address in the form shared with you in the chatting area, so we may send your certificate of attendance. And also don't forget to join us in the special InfoSec seminar organized by ISC Square, Alberta Chapter, Concordia University of Edmonton, and the Women in Cybersecurity Western Canada affiliate on November 29 between 12 to 1. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.